Our next speaker is Dr. Anne Marie Kimball, who we're very pleased to have here. She's a professor of epidemiology and health services in the School of Public Health and Community Medicine. She's an attending physician at the International Clinic and Harborview Medical Center, and she's the director of the Asia Pacific Emerging Infections Network and an adjunct professor in medicine. Dr. Kimball's research interests are in emerging infections and global epidemic prevention, surveillance, investigation, and the control of infectious disease. She was formerly the regional advisor for HIV and AIDS with the World Health Organization and the director of the Washington State HIV/AIDS STD program with the Department of Health. And I wanted to draw attention to two very important awards that she's gotten. One, because her daughter's here, and it's nice to let her daughter see how cool her mom is. And second, because we're proud to have faculty like this. And she received the New Century Scholar for Fulbright and the Guggenheim Foundation Scholar Award. So with that, I give you Dr. Kimball.
Do I need to turn myself on, or do I need to turn this on? What I'd like to talk to you tonight about, the title of my talk is SARS, Influenza, Emergence, and Pandemic Prevention. And what I'm going to do is talk about how infections emerge and point out what we know and what we don't know, and give you some conceptual models to think about emergence in your spare time. As you're driving is a good time to think about emergence. I do that a lot. Sort of how do bugs go from one species to the next? How does a bug or a microbe that we've never seen before become a major human pathogen? We'll talk a little bit about that. I'd like to talk about some of the ecological pressures that the human community is putting in place in the world today that's changing the microbial level of the world as well. And then we'll go into some specific examples very quickly of how trade and industry and travel impact that. We'll talk a little bit about some of the prevention that we can do and some of the work that we're doing here at the University of Washington to wrap up. The factors of emergence were first outlined by the Institute of Medicine in 1992 in a report called The Emergence of New Infections, and it was a working group led by Joshua Lederberg, who of course is a Nobel laureate in genetics. But the factors that this working group of the Institute pointed out were not at the bench. They weren't temperature, they weren't pH, they weren't the gram stain of the bacteria. They were in fact these factors: demography, the population pressure, behavior of people, public health infrastructure breakdown, travel, technology trade, changes in the microbes themselves, climate change, war, intentional release of microbes in bioterror attacks, land use. This is one of the models I promised you. This is the emergence of new infectious diseases from zoonotic diseases, or those diseases which are in animals. In fact, over 70% of new human pathogens over our entire human history have come from animals, other vertebrates, cows, dogs, monkeys, different vertebrates, but emerged from the other vertebrates into the human family at some point through some emerging event. As you see in this model of wildlife emerging infections, domestic animal emerging infections, and human emerging infections, the factors of emergence showed around the three globes here are those which could be some of the precipitating factors in seeing new human infections. This is another model, another way of looking at the same kind of problem. We use a lot of these conceptual models because it's a really complicated thing to think about the physical environmental factors which may impact microbes. They are affected by climate and temperature. They are affected by salinity. Genetic and biological factors, the microbes themselves, the human factors, the ecological factors, and then the social, political, and economic factors. All of these working together somehow are causing us to have brand new human infections. Let's get a little more specific. I work largely in the Asia-Pacific region, and in our region we've had an unprecedented number of new emergent infections over the last couple of decades because of our demographic pressures, because of our infrastructure challenges in many of the countries around the Pacific. We have rapidly increasing travel and trade linkages. And so we have a common challenge in our region to also microbial resistance to antibiotics. But we've seen the emergence of Nipah virus, influenza, with the avian flu threat being only the most recent. Every few years we have a major new pandemic of influenza, and annually we have an epidemic of influenza, enterovirus, and of course SARS. There are major economic impacts in our region every time we have the emergence of a new infection. And I would illustrate this with SARS, which caused more than $15 billion of damage to the affected economies in the region through that travel-related infection. But why is this happening? I mean, what's going on here? It's a really complicated system, and part of it has to do with world population. We're now 6.2 billion people on the planet. And if you saw the recent projections, by the year 2050, we'll be 9 billion people on the planet. And unfortunately, the landmass of the planet isn't growing. So as you can see, we're at about 6.2, and this has been the growth since 1950, when we were at a population of about 3 billion. So we're rapidly increasing the population on the planet of humans. But we're also concentrating ourselves into urban centers. And these are some projections which show you that over time, increasingly, the urbanization is going to be concentrated in developing countries or poor countries where there's poor infrastructure and poor ability to support the concentrated populations in major cities. And we've always had an uneven access to water and sanitation. This is a graph from the World Bank. And if you look just at the bottom bars, those in the diagonal show you the number of billions of people without adequate sanitation. And the up and down gray bar shows you the number without clean water. Now, this slide is from 1990, and I just reviewed these figures. And in fact, the water gap, the 1.2 billion people without adequate water, has remained about static, which means we've actually constructed a lot of new water systems to keep up with the population. But the gap in sanitation has not changed, and so we've actually got more than 2.1 billion people without adequate sanitation in the globe today. It's interesting when you think that a country like the People's Republic of China, with 1.2 billion people living on 40% of the arable landmass of the United States, have only 30% of that population with adequate sanitation. You begin to get the picture of what's going on in the region. This is a picture from the subcontinent of what uncontrolled urbanization looks like in that part of Asia. But what is starting to also happen is some of the human factors in industrialization and the processes we're putting in place, both in travel and in trade and commerce. We're doing some very unusual and new things, innovating in our production and intensifying our production of food and other food animals and other substances. And in this process, we're not taking into account our uneven infrastructure in water and sanitation and our increasing population concentration. So let's just talk a little bit about avian flu. Our hypothesis is that when you have this basic planetary overload of 6.2 billion people living on the globe today, with more than 2 billion people without adequate sanitation, and you have the globalization of travel and trade, you're creating a risk for the emergence of infection. So if you intensify your agriculture, and in this picture you'll see a model farm from Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, where poultry agriculture has been intensified, in a poor sanitary environment, you create a risk. Southeast Asia, as we know, has been battling highly pathogenic avian influenza for 3 years with continuing outbreaks. How many chickens is too many chickens? It's a basic question. We don't know the critical threshold. Much less do we know the critical threshold for how much you can intensify poultry agriculture in the absence of adequate sanitation and good water. We do know that avian influenza is successfully transmitting from feline to feline and occasionally from human to human, and that's why you're beginning to hear so much about this new bird flu. So I'd like to give you another conceptual model, and this is the model of pandemic prevention. The reason that we worry so much about avian influenza, I'll talk a little bit in a moment about, is because if it becomes highly infectious, we are at risk of a pandemic. A pandemic being just an epidemic that affects increasingly broad areas of the globe. So if we create a sort of what I call a pyramid of prevention, primary prevention would be preventing the point of emergence, preventing the emergence in the first place, preventing that species jumping from animals to humans of an infectious agent, preventing that ecological pressure. How do we do that? What are the specifications of how we do that? It's still pretty mysterious, and that research is ongoing but needs to be done much more intensely. Second level would be your local extension. If we had an emergence of a new infection here in Seattle in one neighborhood, local public health would help us contain it within that neighborhood, and we wouldn't have extension into Oregon or into California. And then the pandemic would be when you begin to hop across national borders with that infection and also across bodies of water. Let's talk again about avian influenza. We know there's been a 25-fold increase in poultry exports in birds and meat from the Far East in less than a decade since 2000, preceding 2000. And I think this is a definite indicator of poultry industry intensification. So I've shown you some maps here. The top map is the density of poultry in Southeast Asia. The bottom map is the density of human beings. And you can see where the red dots are, where we have about 700 people per kilometer squared, are concentrated roughly in the same areas where the red dots for the chickens are. So you've got chickens and humans living in unprecedented closeness, and you've got the superimposed recent intensification of poultry practice. This is just to show you the exports from those Far East Asian countries from 1961 through 2002, just to demonstrate that we're now over 1,800,000 tons, coming from a level in 1985 of less than 200,000 tons of exports. So what goes on with avian influenza? Well, the reason people are so concerned is that in 1957, when we had our epidemic of Asian flu, which many of you probably remember, I certainly do, the Spanish flu was circulating in the human family, as you see at the top of the slide, and at the same time an H2N2 duck virus was circulating among ducks. And it's believed that the infection of intermediate hosts, that is to say the chicken or the pig, with both of those RNA viruses simultaneously, allowed the viruses to reassort in the chicken or the pig and then become the H2N2 Asian virus, which swept across great territories of the globe. The hypothesis is that with the H5 virus circulating in ducks and chickens, and the impact of a human virus co-circulating could be that we would have the same kind of mixing, and the resultant RNA recombinant flu virus would be able to infect humans much more efficiently. Where we are right now is we have very active surveillance in place for avian influenza throughout Southeast Asia, and you may have heard that another human case was diagnosed today. It has very high human mortality, even if you take into account the recent discussions of serology, but it has very poor transmission from person to person. Most of the cases, with the exception of, I think, 2 pairs currently, have been infections directly from poultry to humans as opposed to from human to human. But as of the day before yesterday, before the final case, we had 42 deaths in 55 cases in Southeast Asia of the avian influenza. We don't know what the threshold, what the critical threshold is for a pandemic. We don't know what level to watch for before it takes off. So all we can do is strengthen our surveillance both in the laboratory and in the countries of Southeast Asia. And also extensive chicken culling has been done. That is to say, millions of chickens have already been culled to prevent infection. But this isn't the only example of ramping up and consolidation, advances in processing impacting the emergence of infection. In fact, HIV/AIDS was an example of this. We were the sole producing nation of factor VIII. We had 6 major pharmaceutical producers when we figured out how to lyophilize this blood factor, which is used to treat hemophiliacs. 1 unit of factor VIII can contain up to 10,000 units of pooled human donor blood. We did this in the 1980s at a time when, coincidentally, we had HIV in our blood supply, which we were unaware of prior to 1982, when the first clinical cases of HIV were diagnosed in the population. Note that AIDS has an incubation period prior to being clinically apparent of about 10 years. So for that full window of 10 years, we were in fact producing an infectious product. So unfortunately, this is how HIV migrated into a number of countries in Central America, where I was working, and also into Japan. Another example, similarly, would be E. Coli O157 H7, where we had incredible consolidation of feedlots and slaughtering prior to the emergence, as we saw in the Jack-in-the-Box outbreak in the 1990s. And finally, mad cow disease and new variant Jakob-Creutzfeldt. If you go back through the history of the emergence of this new prion disease, you'll see that the British beef industry was in the process of seeking new efficiencies through changing its rendering practices of how they treat carcasses to get meat and bone meal. And in doing so, they changed their rendering process to save energy. So they went to a vacuum extraction process as opposed to a solvent heat process where they had previously heated the carcasses to hundreds of degrees centigrade for hours. And that change and that lack of heat was correlated with the emergence of prion disease. They had probably for 50 years been feeding bits of sheep to cows in meat and bone meal. The true change was the rendering practice change, and that rendering practice change was changed because of changing market pressure on the beef industry. So these are the mechanisms that I've tried to summarize quickly. Direct contagion, once you have an emergence, from the primary point of emergence into the secondary level. And the mechanism of transmission into a pandemic then would be trade and travel. So let's think a little bit about travel. We've talked a little bit about trade. We all know we have more destinations, more flights, more travelers, more affordability. And the People's Republic of China is now the third most traveling country. And in fact, this time of year is the time of Chinese New Year, when literally millions and millions and millions of people are traveling within China itself. But just to illustrate how travel has changed, this is a very interesting illustration from Dr. Haggett. He is the son in this photo. And as you can see, these are life paths. So his great-grandfather traveled a total radius of 10 kilometers during his lifetime. His grandfather traveled 100 kilometers away from his home in the United Kingdom. His father traveled 1,000 kilometers. And you can see what the son has done, going all over the world. I think this is a really graphic illustration of the range of travel and how it's changing for us. But this is another illustration that's very important, because this one actually shows you, in terms of color, up to 25,000 travelers a day. And as described in the caption, the links represent the links between the 500 largest airports in 100 countries and the rate per day of travel between those countries. It's a pretty impressive connected world. This was done by Hofnagel at the Max Planck. And he did this to begin to actually model the international transmission of Sars, and to see if, creating a model, he could predict what we actually saw with Sars, and then went back and plugged the Sars data into it. But this is the beginning of an effort to take disease modeling, which we've used in populations for probably a decade, and begin to internationalize it and understand these travel and trade links. I think this is where the future lies in terms of being able to successfully defend populations. These are some projections from industry of what Asia-Pacific air passenger travel will be. We're right on track at about 2009, hundreds of millions of arrivals on an annual basis. This is SARS, and this actually is a slide of a single case of SARS. We're all familiar with the story, I'm sure, of the Hong Kong physician who stayed in the Hotel Metropole. And when he stayed in the Hotel Metropole, he actually transmitted disease to all of the countries shown in these small circles. 219 healthcare workers and 30 non-healthcare workers. I won't go into the issues of hospital infection control of SARS, which was absolutely central, but the travel and the range geographically of SARS brought into high relief the risk that we now have with new disease emergence coming from our own intensification of activity and crowding, and then our air links and our trade links. This shows you where SARS was as of the 25th of June, a total of 8,460 cases with 808 deaths, but just get an appreciation of the geographic range of this disease. It was traveling by airplane, and it wasn't very infectious on board, but it proved to be extremely infectious once it got into the hospital in the ill individual who arrived from an infectious destination. So where are the brakes on the global express of trade and travel? What can we do in public health once we have an emergence to prevent that emergence from extending and becoming a pandemic? Well, we know that isolation and quarantine and local epidemiologic investigation are the keys. But how strong those local systems are all around the world, highly variable. Highly variable. In fact, we don't even know in our own trading partners in the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation systematically what's local quarantine law from one country to the next. Recall of infectious product from the marketplace is not very effective. There's estimates that we may get 10% of product back if we find that it's contaminated. Tracking of arrivals, we saw during the plague epidemic in Surat that you can get about 50% of suspected plague victims as they come into the airport. The other 50% are already at home. So that's not terribly effective if you have a highly infectious respiratory disease. Travel advisories were used during SARS, and these proved to be very effective. And this was an unprecedented use by the World Health Organization of this mechanism. We've always had travel advisories. When you go traveling, you can always go to the Yellow Book and find where you shouldn't go because it's too dangerous for your health. But this was really a systematic effort on the part of WHO to define criteria to advise the traveling public to avoid location. And their criteria were a number of cases per day at the location that was your destination. But secondly, had that destination country exported any cases in the last week? So in the case of Toronto, for example, Toronto was furious that they had a travel advisory issued against them. At the same time, there were cases showing up in Philippines which had been infected in Toronto. And as long as that continued, WHO felt the advisory was appropriate. So these are our remedies shown on the left-hand side of this slide. The World Health Organization has a set of international health regulations. The World Trade Organization has a set of agreements that also impact trade flows. But the real important point, I think, is that national agencies and most importantly local public health are the key defense to prevent this cascade up to a pandemic. The new international health regulations I'll just talk a little bit about because we're actually in a really important time. This is a process that's been going on since 1996. These are the only existing regulations that allow health authorities to impact trade and travel in a formal treaty basis. They're signed by all 150 member countries of WHO. They're planned to be submitted to the World Health Assembly in March of 2005. So last week, they just finished the last week of negotiations. And I wish I could tell you if those were successful or not. But as of yet, the jury is still out. It creates a positive obligation to create capacity to control epidemics in countries. That's a really new thing. We've always pretended all countries could do this. But this actually creates a treaty obligation if they're accepted. A mechanism for declaring a public health emergency, transparency in how travel advisories will be issued when they're needed by the WHO. This is just a decision tree for countries to use within the international health regulations to ask themselves these questions. They are using syndromic data. It's not dependent on a diagnosis. You don't have to have plague or yellow fever or cholera, as you did previously, to use the international health regulations. This is for any serious disease. And what national authorities would do is go through this flow diagram, this decision diagram, to decide what is notifiable and not notifiable under the regulations, and to get the international authority of WHO behind that disease control effort. In APEC, we've been working with influenza response scenarios and trying to promote preparedness through our APEC Emerging Infections Network. And we've been working with the APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation countries for the last 9 years in disease alerts. Over that 9 years, we've succeeded with a number of other interested parties in getting the leaders of APEC to endorse the control of emerging infections since 2000 as one of the key top policy concerns of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. This is a trade cooperation. These guys are much more interested in the bottom line. However, they recognize that the impact of emerging infections in our region has been serious enough to warrant prioritizing that among their countries. We have a rapidly increasing speed and access to the internet in the region, and we're making use of this. And so what we're trying to promote with this group of countries, working through the Health Task Force and through the Industrial Science and Tech Working Group, is the use of scenario exercises that we can do jointly with other countries to understand where the policy gaps are, where the communications gaps are, what's Singapore going to do, what's Japan going to do, what's China going to do when we have the next pandemic, when we have the next emergence of a new human infection, which is only a matter of time. We believe that collective work like this in a very open forum is going to be the most successful strategy. And just the other piece of this story, which is not a health piece, it's actually a networking piece. These are the research and education connectivity networks across the Pacific in December of 2004. And what's important here is that these big pipes for internet access weren't built for health alone. They were built for research. They were built for commerce. But what we're trying to do is to bring this high-speed communication technology into the service of public health in the region, and I hope we'll be successful. So what's in the future? Well, we definitely have the threat of a pandemic, be it avian influenza, be it SARS, or be it whatever we cook up next in our very crowded and complicated and diverse region of the Asia-Pacific. Local public health preparedness is absolutely the first line of defense. And as much as we as a wealthy country can assist poorer countries and middle-income countries in establishing that basic local capacity, the more problems we will save our entire community. We have microsurveillance in place for influenza. People are closely watching that H5N1 virus to watch as it either does or does not become more infectious to humans. And alarms are being periodically issued from WHO, as you heard last week, and from the Centers for Disease Control, who was also commenting on this threat last week. Antiviral stockpiling is being considered, and it's in place in some economies. It's being considered by the United States because we don't have a vaccine for bird flu. And in fact, it would be unrealistic to believe we would have a vaccine prior to the incursion of bird flu for a lot of technical reasons. So thank you, and I hope you'll visit our website and learn more about the Emerging Infections Network. Thank you.
That was great. You'll have questions. Perfect. Our next speaker is Dr. John Chem Nur. Dr. Chem Nur did his Ph.D. in microbiology at Michigan State University and did his postdoctoral training here at the University of Washington. He's a member of the Department of Genome Sciences. He's actually involved in too many projects to list. However, I think his most important role is as the Assistant Director of the University of Washington Center of Excellence in Biodefense and Emerging Infectious Diseases. It's one of only 8 centers funded nationally, and a lot of his focus is to protect the public from agents of bioterrorism as well as emerging natural biologic agents. So with that, I welcome Dr. Chem Nur to the podium.
I'm very pleased to be invited to speak before this crowd. I'd like to talk tonight about emerging infectious diseases from the standpoint of understanding the mechanisms by which new diseases emerge and what finding out information about this process can do towards helping us to prepare for new and unexpected diseases. So emerging infectious diseases are a compelling area of study because they're frequently a source of some of our most devastating outbreaks. They have wide impacts on global economy, tourism, and trade. We've seen that earlier tonight, and in fact on national security. It can be described as a local problem with global implications. All diseases arise at some point, but in this modern age they can spread quite rapidly from continent to continent. What the study of emerging infectious diseases underscores is a complex interrelationship between the reservoirs of infection of the pathogenic agents that exist in nature and their host animals, including humans. And also, this study shows us areas where we need to develop our capability and point our research efforts towards developing responses towards these new threats. So, in terms of natural history of emerging infectious diseases in general terms, it may be important to think of all infectious disease as essentially having emerged at some point during history. We know some of the recent examples, but we can look at some more well-known diseases such as plague, which is thought to have emerged as far back as 20,000 years ago when a related strain acquired the ability to propagate in fleas and other insect hosts. Today there exists a related strain which causes a mild disease, but Yersinia pestis, which causes plague, is a relatively new emergent disease and causes a quite virulent disease. Tuberculosis emerged in prehistory. Some of the evidence for symptoms of tuberculosis can be found through paleoanthropology, in fact. An early hypothesis thought that this might have arisen in cattle because of a closely related species. Current molecular evidence now says that this might not be the case, that there is a closely related organism that infects both cattle and humans, which itself emerged from a progenitor ancestor. And this is another point that underscores the need to understand the relationship between the reservoirs of infection in nature and its relationship with the host, which for this talk I'll consider ourselves, unfortunately, as human beings. So how do diseases emerge? How do they become diseases in a human population? Sometimes an organism is competent for causing disease and all it needs is a route of exposure to a human host. And when it does so, it can cause a disease. Pathogens can also acquire virulence factors, and these are genes and they're gene products which now enable the bacterium to survive and replicate within human beings and cause disease and spread themselves to new hosts. Some examples of this are what's known as phage-mediated virulence. Now, believe it or not, something as small as a bacterium can itself get a disease. There's a specific class of bacteria which infect. There's a certain class of virus that will infect bacteria. These are called phage. And in some cases, the phage can transmit some of the genetic information to the bacterial host. And these, in rare cases, are toxins then which allow productive disease on the part of the infected bacterium. Diphtheria is a case of this, and cholera is another case where the toxin arrives on a virus that infects the bacterium. Also, genetic elements called plasmids, which are easily exchanged between bacteria, can carry virulence factors and multiple drug resistance genes, again, which can promote disease or resistance to treatment. And in general, any bacterium is undergoing the process of mutation and selection, and through these processes can acquire the ability to cause disease by conversion of the function of one gene to new ability to survive in a human host. So those are some of the mechanisms, some of the driving impetus which would accelerate disease emergence lie on the other side in the host population. Population growth is an important one. Critically, this influences density, and a more closely packed human population spread can be much more rapid. Habitat intrusion can bring human activities into endemic reservoirs of disease where they have not been before and become exposed to pathogens which can then cause disease. Global foreshortening by rapid travel, tourism, people going more frequently to more remote places than ever can also give us access to these disease reservoirs. New human activities can provide new routes of infection, such as any of a wide number of behaviors, such as dietary choice. The pursuit of so-called bush meat places demands on habitats which may have been formerly isolated, but which brings biological material into the population and could spread disease. Also new technology, transplants between human beings and also from animal donors is a possible new route of infection for disease. The globalization of the food supply also contributes to the spread of disease in that we're getting more food from different places, and food itself is making more trips to locations before it arrives at our supermarket. A few more driving factors are when a disease can encounter a susceptible population of hosts. An example of this is the sweeping of smallpox through the North American continent through the population of Native American Indians, which had very little initial resistance to it. Currently, we have something of a demographic population since smallpox has been eliminated from the wild through vaccination programs. Vaccination has ceased, and now we're starting to see a larger and larger number of people who have not been vaccinated against smallpox and could be susceptible to it in the case of an outbreak. International commerce, changing climate and ecosystems can bring habitat intrusion back the other way. In other words, some of the hosts or the vectors for disease may be better able to survive in the area where people are living. A warmer climate will allow mosquitoes to persist longer over the winter and bring the possibility of transmission of disease that way. Economic development in land use, land pressed into new uses, aerosolization of soils can distribute bacteria that were not previously accessible. War and poverty, with their devastating effects on public health infrastructure and sanitation, can promote disease transmission, and also deliberate release of microorganisms by an individual intending to do harm. Now, I think we'll find that we know a number of emerging infectious diseases. These should be familiar to a number of people in the audience. Legionnaires disease, caused by a previously unknown bacterium, an aquatic bacterium, but found to be growing in an air cooling unit in Philadelphia, which caused an infection in 1976. Toxic shock syndrome, which is Staphylococcus aureus, associated with usage of certain brands of tampons, which is a known pathogen but in a new milieu. Ebola and its associated hemorrhagic fever viruses, and the natural reservoir for Ebola is still unknown at this point. It's presumed to be a small mammal on the African continent, but the exact nature of this reservoir is unknown. HIV and AIDS emerged in the 80s, which is now a global pandemic, as we've heard earlier tonight. Lyme disease transmitted by deer ticks, the so-called flesh-eating bacteria, which acquired the virulence factor, allowing Staphylococcus to degrade skin tissue, and mad cow disease, a prion disease, spread through diet. And this list here shows kind of a remarkable assortment of different pathogens in that we have represented viruses, bacteria, and even in the case of mad cow disease, prion, which is essentially a malformed protein, which is nonetheless infectious. So diseases can emerge from a number of different classes of pathogens. In the 1990s, Hantavirus emerged in the desert Southwest among rodent populations. We've heard tonight about E. Coli O157 H7, which in fact is different from the E. coli, which normally inhabits our intestinal flora by the additional presence of as few as 2 additional genes, which can cause serious and sometimes fatal disease. West Nile virus, which I'll go into some detail in a moment, which is endemic to the old world, but now spreading through the new world. Nipah virus, whose reservoir is thought to be in bats, but spread to pigs and became infectious during agriculture. And Norwalk virus, which is notorious for ruining many people's cruise destinations by causing gastrointestinal disease in kind of a mimic of a small concentrated village, and we can see the effects of a restricted community there. More emerging infectious diseases of the current era would be vancomycin-resistant Staph aureus. Staph aureus is an important hospital-acquired pathogen, and vancomycin is one of the last mainline broad-spectrum antibiotics with which we have to treat this, and the acquisition of resistance to this antibiotic by this organism is a serious health concern. Sars, which we heard about earlier this evening, and influenza I've included in emerging infectious diseases because, as we've seen by its recombination mechanism, it essentially reemerges every year by genetic reassortment in a new version, and so it deserves to be on the yearly list. Now, I showed a diminishing list of diseases, but that's not representative of the emerging diseases. Those are merely some choices I made for illustration. This World Health Organization chart shows, for the period of 1994 to 1999, unexpected outbreaks, and you can see here again is the local problem with global implications, because we can see emergence sites, in fact, all over the populated Earth. Some properties of emergent diseases are, in a lot of cases, but not all, is the acquisition of host-to-host spread. The ability to spread between humans is often what triggers a rapidly spreading epidemic or pandemic. Newly emergent diseases can show a behavior of essentially burning through a population where they encounter hosts who have not seen the disease before and are susceptible, but as they move through, susceptible hosts either recover or succumb, leaving a less susceptible population behind. And the morbidity and mortality, or in other words, sickness and death caused by emergent infectious disease can in a lot of cases be quite virulent disease, although not in all cases, but then can be seen to taper off over time as treatment and adaptation of the organism attenuate the power of the infection. The ways in which emerging diseases are recognized in the laboratory are to first isolate the causative agent from cases presenting with a new disease, then to attempt to grow the pathogen in laboratory culture, and this can allow us to extract rapidly DNA sequence information from the pathogen. I'll point out here that with our current technology, we do not necessarily need to be able to culture the pathogen in order to gain DNA sequence information. With some educated guesses, we can use PCR technology to amplify sequences and to get a glimpse of the relatedness of a new pathogen to other known pathogens without being able to grow it in culture. But some other complementary modes of analysis of new diseases is to establish animal models of infection to show that we can reproduce the human variant of the disease and to demonstrate an antibody response to this isolated pathogen in patients who have the disease, documenting that this is the organism causing the new disease. So to illustrate some of these points, I'll give 2 quick case histories. First with West Nile virus. It was discovered in Uganda in 1937, but it was unknown in the Western Hemisphere until a focal infection point in New York City where birds, horses, and the first North American human cases were reported. It then began a rapid spread through mosquito-borne transmission, western spread through the United States, and at the current moment we have 9,300 documented cases and 240 deaths. But West Nile virus is already starting to exhibit some of the burn-through behavior in that in the areas lagging behind the infection is less common and less severe. We also heard tonight about SARS, and in that case, a new type of virus, or a coronavirus, arose in a natural population of wild animals. The palm civet infected human handlers, and then as we saw, a traveler went to a hotel, began person-to-person spread. These people got on airplanes, and there was rapid global spread by air travel. The keys to SARS mitigation, once this new respiratory infection was recognized, was a rapid containment effort on the part of world non-governmental authorities such as the World Health Organization, which helped to put in place local, national, and regional response efforts, including surveillance for the monitoring of new cases, increasing communications between laboratories, which led to rapid identification of this agent as a coronavirus, the institution of travel restrictions, and isolation and quarantine of infected individuals. And I'll point out here that isolation and quarantine is not always appropriate in all cases, and so its use needs to be carefully balanced against the public health benefits of not unduly restricting the susceptible population to increase compliance with health policy directives. Now, in the case of SARS, it has occasionally reemerged, and we're waiting for reemergences of SARS through the surveillance networks. And I'll touch on, at this point, some properties of reemergent infectious disease. And these can be organisms that we're already familiar with, but gain new resistance to treatments. Now, multiply drug resistance tuberculosis is a prime example of this, of an infectious agent that was appearing to come under control, but then with the emergence of drug resistance, it has become, almost as hard to treat as the original instance of the disease. Reemergence can also depend on seasonality. Hantavirus is an example of this, where in the desert Southwest, drought conditions can affect population sizes and behavior of the rodent carrier population. And reemergent infectious diseases reemerge from their sources of reservoir where they're maintained in the natural environment. They can be reintroduced from the animals in which they reside, from unrecognized persistent human infections. Think of typhoid Mary in this case, and in some rare cases, but in the case of SARS, laboratory-acquired infections. And also, in our planning, we need to think about deliberate reintroduction of some diseases which we hold under control. Some threats for the current era is avian flu, and Kimball gave us some good descriptions of avian flu. At the moment, its 75% mortality rate is very sobering. But the human-to-human transmission lets us bide a little time while we develop response capabilities. It's unknown when and if the avian flu gains easy human-to-human transmission, what the mortality rate will be, but chances are it'll be fairly serious. You might have heard of the reemergence of respiratory plague in African miners. So here we have a case where we have a population restricted to a confined environment where respiratory spread has led to a reemergence in that case. And also an occurrence of melioidosis behind the tsunami event of recent months, which is caused by a soil organism, which under cases of flood or rainy season can cause disease, and in the dramatic event of the tsunami is causing widespread soil disturbance. So what can we do to prepare ourselves for emerging infectious diseases? Well, we need to stay flexible, and we need to be able to quickly execute some of our best guesses. And we need to get information about what we're anticipating to our clinicians, who are really the first responders in any type of outbreak. Patients will show up at their doctor's office presenting disease, and these will be the first individuals who will recognize a new disease. Laboratory capacity to process clinical specimens, as well as expand research on the new agents. Data specimen management is important, especially in the early going, to track the original spread and to identify index cases. Communication between laboratories especially helped identification of coronavirus as causative agent for SARS. Establishing the agency in charge and involving environmental and engineering sciences can contribute to a rapid response, as well as coordination of the public health response within communities and between nations. And so vigilance with the alert networks and surveillance will let us know what might be coming down the path. From the research side, we can use a little bit of what I call molecular anticipation, and this is used every year in formulation of the influenza vaccine, which is a best guess of what antigenic determinants are going to show up in influenza for any given year, and these are formulated into the vaccine. New technologies could let us develop new ways to treat new disease by exploiting some general mechanisms of pathogenesis in some of the following ways. Vaccination and vaccine development will help us to address some of these diseases which may re-emerge, for which we have unsuitable vaccines which have side effects or inadequate protection. We can also use a new class of compounds called immunomodulators, which can enhance the basic immune response of individuals, which is a generalized class of response against bacteria and other pathogens, which doesn't require previous exposure to the organism. Development of rapid detection and diagnostic tests can also let us determine the disease a particular individual has, which would enhance their prognosis for treatment, and also let us know new diseases and stem the outbreak of an epidemic or pandemic earlier on in the process. And in a more outreaching way, more basic research on disease mechanisms should help us to identify general mechanisms of pathogenesis caused by viruses and bacteria, and give us new areas of attack to counter diseases for which we lack specific responses, but that can give us therapies that we can rapidly deploy in the case of an outbreak. And the University of Washington, as a world leader in infectious disease basic science research, hopefully will be able to come up with some of these new answers to develop some rapid treatments. Thank you very much.